So literary history has for long been subject to methodological nationalism bias. This bias results from the fact that literary history, like history itself, was tightly linked to the creation of national identities. Studies of national literatures, American, French, German, or Italian literature constitute individual disciplines separate from the study of other literary traditions, which were taught in either language or comparative literature departments. While comparative literature promoted a more universalist, though often dehistoricized conception of literature, reflection on cultural transfers appeared either in language departments or in small countries like Israel or Belgium, whose own literatures had not acquired full legitimacy as a result of the relative youth of the nation in the case of Israel, or because of its peripheral position in a particular linguistic area, in the case of Belgium, in the Francophone area. It is therefore necessary to denationalize literary history. But how? I would like to propose here an approach which combines comparative structural history with the study of cultural transfer using Bourdieu's field theory, and I will also refer to Evan Zohar's polysystem theory and to Moretti's distance reading that can be combined with field approach. Field approach offers a broader sociological framework for taking into account the social context of production and circulation of works. According to field theory, the literary world can, in effect, be studied as a relatively autonomous universe. However, to methodologically autonomize this world requires an examination of the socio-historical conditions which allowed for this autonomization from political, economic, and religious constraints. Moreover, the autonomy is always relative. Political and socio-economic constraints still weigh on literary activity, but indirectly. Constraints are mediatized or refracted or retranslated through, according to the literary field's specific stakes, rules, and structural principles. The mediations between works and social conditions can be located at three levels. First, the material conditions of text production and circulation. Second, the social conditions and modalities of the creative process. Third, conditions of text reception. In terms of text production conditions, mediations include field structure, for instance, struggles amongst established writers and newcomers for either conservation or transformation of the legitimate definition of literature, literary institutions, literary societies, academies, awards, conception of the author's social role, for instance, the opposition between art for art's sake and committed literature, and professional ideology values such as disinterestedness, responsibility. In terms of the creation of works, mediations include the space of possibilities, available models and options, and construction of the work, style, composition, narrative devices, the latter resulting from the way the author has incorporated this space of this space of possibilities according to his or her own social trajectory. Finally, you can differentiate between heteronymous judgments expressed by different groups and authorities, such as morality leagues, courts, political organizations, associations, which focus on content and on moral and ideological aspects of the work, and the aesthetic judgment focusing on formal aspects of the work, thus illustrating the field's mediating effect on the reception of the work. Field theory provides a framework for systematic comparison across countries. However, specialists in cultural transfer studies, along with promoters of the notion of entangled history, have pointed out the limits of comparativism. Comparativism rests upon a methodological nationalism that considers neither the common cultural heritage nor cultural transfers on the basis of which national cultures are founded. I don't think that it is a sufficient reason to abandon comparativism, but it needs to be combined with the study of these two aspects, common heritage and cultural transfers, through a transnational approach. The critics against comparativism should also lead us to interrogate the geographic borders. Is the relevant unit the nation-state? Is it the linguistic area? Is it the empire, as we saw with the Austro-Hungarian Empire yesterday with Marjorie? Or is it a more local territory? The answer to this question depends, of course, on the object under study and cannot be decided a priori. I will first develop a comparative structural approach of literary history and will then focus on cultural transfers. My claim is that combining these two approaches is a necessary but not sufficient method for a transnational literary history. We also need to take into account the power relations between languages and cultures to understand both the differences and exchanges between them, following Pascal Casanova's work, but also taking into account economic power relations in the book market and political constraints, as well as phenomena of hegemony. I will end with some considerations regarding socio-historical dynamics. From a methodological standpoint, structural history requires to articulate three temporalities: the long term of institutions and categories, the mid-term of social configuration, and the short term of strategies and interaction, and I'll get back to this point in the conclusion. And of course, to articulate quantitative and qualitative methods, we started discussing that yesterday. So, comparative comparison is sociology's tool par excellence, as Émile Durkheim, one of sociology's founding fathers, argued. Comparisons underscore significant differences. Until we compare a work to others at the same time period, we are unable to understand its singularity or its innovative character for that period. The originality of Flaubert's Madame Bovary, for example, is due to the distant narrative voice. The narrator does not judge Emma, and to free indirect discourse. And this innovation accounts for much of the cause of the scandal surrounding the work, because it was new at the time. It was, as pointed out by Jaus. And yesterday, the example that Marjorie gave to Ted's talk makes sense with regards to the norm that Ted was showing with his graphs, because it was a rupture with these norms. As rigorous comparative method, a rigorous comparative method is also necessary when speaking about context. Such a comparison can operate between time periods and between cultures. Nevertheless, a minimum amount of comparable data is required, in particular a relatively autonomous social activity designated by the term literature. Before the end of the 18th century, however, this was not the case. In France, the notion of literature encompassed philosophy and scientific vulgarization, and although we do locate an antecedent in the notion of belles lettres, it does not overlap with literature in the modern sense. The same is true for comparison between cultures, for it is really with the rise in usage of European languages as a result of colonialism that the question of modern African literature emerges in the 20th century, because beforehand we have oral literature, which is not defined in the same way as modern literature. The comparative approach thus leads us to relativize the notion of literature and to examine its social status at various time periods and in various cultures. It is only with the advent of national literatures that comparison becomes relevant. But the autonomization of a literary field occurred at different periods in different countries. It seems that it first emerged in the 18th century Germany, then maybe in England, and only afterwards in France in the mid-19th century. But this history is not written yet. I mean, these are hypotheses. And we observe a temporal gap, which also must be taken into account. And it's close to what Pascal Casanova described as the Greenwich Meridian, but it's not exactly the same. The Greenwich Meridian is the subjective perception of backwardness or something. Here we're speaking about the objective developments in different countries. Among literary theories, polysystem theory, developed by Evan Zohar following the Russian formalists, was a fruitful attempt to develop a systemic study of the elements interrelating in the literary space without normative a priori specifications about what falls under literature and what does not. Polysystem theory is thus not only interested in the canon of recognized works, but also in non-canonical works, minor or popular genre, and sub-genre like the detective or romance novel or children's literature. This opposition between canonical and non-canonical organizes all literary systems around a legitimacy-based hierarchy. At the same time, systems can be compared with regards to the repertoire of available or accessible models. An easy example, the rhyme, for instance, was an absolute poetic constraint until the end of the 19th century. The beginning of the 20th century it was abandoned, and in the second half of the century it became impossible to use the rhyme if one wanted to gain recognition in poetry. And we could compare when this happened in different countries. But then the question would be, did this change was the result of, was this change the result of circulation? And if it was, probably, we could identify circulation patterns. Systematic comparison can be made of developments in genre and subgenre at different time periods and in different cultures. Quantitative methods are irreplaceable tools for practicing distance reading, as suggested by Franco Moretti. Using trend curves, he demonstrates that a very similar boom of the novel occurred in Great Britain between 1720 and 1740, then in Japan between 1745 and 1765, then in Italy between 1820 and 1840, in Spain from 1845 to the beginning of the 1860s, and finally in Nigeria between 1965 and 1980. He also shows the succession of literary fashions in Great Britain. The epistolary novel triumphs between 1760 and 1790, but it is replaced around 1800 by the Gothic novel, and from the 1820s by the historical novel. This quantitative method can apply to other categories of texts, translations for example, which have been neglected by literary history, or print runs, or sales. A systematic comparison of the share of translations in a country's total editorial production reveals, for instance, that the percentage increases as we move from central cultures to peripheral ones, as pointed out by Johann Herborn. Between 1989 and 1991, the figure is at 3% in the United States and Great Britain, 15 to 20% in France and Germany, 25% in Italy and Spain, and 65% in Sweden. I have other figures here, Portugal 35%. Comparison itself thus operates within a system of asymmetrical relations between cultures, and thus the opposition center-periphery proves very useful to understand this asymmetrical circulation. So you can see that the more a country is central, the less it translates. It exports a lot, and I'll give the figures later, but it imports very few translations. We can also study the evolution of the share of translation in the book market across time. For instance, in France, it rose from 10% in the 1970s, to 60s to 14% in the 1970s, and it jumped to 18% at the moment of defined as globalization. And it could be interpreted as a relative decline of France on the international book markets. We can also compare the variation between categories of translated books, because what I'm giving here is the overall share of translated books in the book market. But if you look at the genre, a particular category of book, for instance literature, then you see that it's twice as much as the average. So for new novels in France today, in the 1990s, it's between 35 to 40% of translations in the book market. So this is true everywhere, because literature is the most translated category of book, but it should be interesting to study the variations across countries. Beyond the study of hierarchization principles and the study of the space of possibilities which echo polysystem theory, field theory provides opportunities for making comparisons on various levels. First, observing the interaction of the literary field with the state provides indicators regarding the field's autonomy. Prior or a posteriori censorship means for orienting production or instrumentalization of literature for propagandist purposes. Authoritarian regime like the Vichy regime in France entails regressions from already gained autonomy. Without separation of church and state, ideological control is generally exercised by the intermediary of the state's religious authorities. Under communist regimes, ideological control was warranted via the centralization and production and diffusion, the centralization of the means of production. Publishing houses were state-controlled, and there was one main publishing house in general. and also professional organization, which was state-organized, the Writers' Union. Deconcentration of political, religious, and economic powers favors the autonomization of the literary field, which can play one power against another. The liberalization of the book market thus fostered the autonomization of the literary field with regards to the state, censorship. But the market also imposed its own constraints, chiefly speaking the law of profitability, which can in turn be counterbalanced by a state policy supporting literary creation based, as in France, on recognition of the autonomy of the literary field. So you have support for upmarket literature, you don't have any support for what is called littérature de gare, commercial literature from the state. And it is thought to counterbalance the law of the market. On the second level, comparisons can be made regarding the principles organizing the structure of the field in various historical states of national context. According to the relational approach, positions in the field are defined in relation to one another. Thus, newcomers in the field must define themselves in relation to the dominating consecrated authors. Ever since Romanticism's law of originality, avant-garde artists, the surrealists for instance, have asserted themselves by denouncing the orthodoxy of current dominant literary conceptions. In turn, they are stigmatized by their elders for their heterodoxy. This opposition between dominant and dominated position can be found in various fields or different states of the same field. It establishes the basis for a structural homology, which makes comparison possible. The literary field is generally structured according to a second principle of opposition, which is autonomy versus heteronomy. Since autonomy is always relative, writers may differentiate themselves according to their autonomy from external demand, whether the demand be ideological or expectation-driven. For instance, in the 19th century, certain authors of serialized novels modified the story in order to meet the reader's demands, expectations. It happens also today, like the example of 50 Shades of Grey, of course. In different historical configurations, autonomy may take different, even contradictory forms according to the social political context. Between art for art's sake, the principle behind which Flaubert and Baudelaire took refuge from the moral judgments made on their work, which led to their trials, and the notion of littérature engagée, of committed literature developed by Sartre. So both can embody autonomy at some point of the history. These ideas can circulate. The art for art's sake comes from Germany, from Kant and from all the Schlegel. We can trace the circulation, and the same thing, the committed literature circulated, for instance, to Germany with the groups 47, with the Grass and all the group adopting this concept. And other places, of course, Arab countries, there was an important reception of Sartre there. Another sociological question that arises from field theory is how to link a space of possibilities with an author's social trajectory. There is no a priori answer to this question. It needs to be studied empirically in each case, but it could be a basis for comparison. Writers' individual or collective trajectories can be thus compared on this basis. The social recruitment of writers based on their social origins and inherited and acquired cultural capital is a fruitful question for quantitative comparative approach for prosopography. For instance, Claire Ducournau shows that African writers who achieved, Francophone African writers who achieved literary recognition since the 1960s mostly come from the elites and are endowed with a high cultural capital. There are a lot of PhDs among them, which would not be the case with French writers at the same moment. And this is even more the case for women, for which the selection process is even harsher. Such comparisons raise more extensive questioning about the link between education and the space of literary possibilities. For example, the homogenizing effects of the classical education required for all general secondary school students in the 19th century, in France, but in other places also, from which group the majority of writers were recruited at the time, or inversely we couldn't think of the effects of early 20th efforts to diversify courses of study. So for instance, Norbert Bandier, work on surrealism shows that the surrealist group, some of them came from modern education, not from classical. And those were the people who were able to reject also the classical heritage, because they were not trained, they were not the guardians of this heritage. They can also shed light on the relation between literature and identity. One of the structural divisions in the space of possibilities is indeed the tension between universalism and particularism. Whether imposed or demanded, identity has been a mode of self-assertion for dominated writers in the social space. Local identity, the regional literature movement in early 20th century France, for instance. Religious identity, there was, for instance, a Catholic literary renaissance in early 20th France, just a moment when there was separation between the state and church. Social identity, there was a movement, for instance, of proletarian writers in the interwar period, and of course gender, writing by women during the 1960s and 1970s, or racial identity, the négritude movement. All of the principles of identity, national identity, is the most universally imposed. We still speak of American, French, German, or Italian writers, and of American, French, German, or Italian literature. This is the fruit of the historical process of nationalizing literature, and moreover, of literary history itself, as already said. It prevails not only in commonplace representation, but also in scholarly conceptions. Like genre, national categories are steady categories in the longue durée history of literature since the 19th century, and they became really central in the period you are interested in, the first half of the 20th century. And yet the link between literature and nation corresponds to social reality as a result of its link with language and of literature's role in constructing national identities, as shown by Benedict Anderson and by Anne-Marie Thiès. National literary canons have nonetheless formed while simultaneously marginalizing and even excluding writers coming from dominated social groups such as women, immigrants, ethnic minorities, the colonized or formerly colonized people, as gender studies, post-colonial studies, or subaltern studies have emphasized. Furthermore, methodological nationalism tends to obscure other phenomena which we will examine at present, and these are, of course, cultural transfers and literary exchanges. So until the end of the 18th century, the common cultural base of the European Republic of Letters was classical education. Latin was its lingua franca. This common literary heritage began disintegrating in the 19th century along with the nationalization of culture. But in reality, as a result of the significance of classical studies in secondary education, it continued to nourish literary culture until the middle of the 20th century. Beyond the common reference that classic writings provided, national language literatures were initially formed by translating works in order to construct a literary and editorial body of works in the national language, which was being codified. The languages were being codified through translations, and also, as polysystem theory work has shown, by importing stylistic models. Acknowledging the original hybrid nature of national literature should it lead us to relativize the idea that cultural métissage is uniquely a result of the recent globalization. Furthermore, the body of translated works proved often to be the same from language to language. These works, written in the oldest literary languages, notably French, English, German, and Russian, became in this way world masterpieces. A transnational canon was thus formed from the very arrival of national literatures, and the canon continued to expand largely as a result of opportunities for international recognition, such as the Nobel Prize, which was created at the beginning of the 20th century, and which, despite it being an international prize, is based on a national conception of literature. It recognizes an author from a specific country, right? Prizes for translated works developed in France, for instance, starting in the afterwar period. Prix du meilleur livre étranger in 1948, Prix Médicis étranger in 1970, Prix Féminin étranger in 1985. So these authorities contributed to the building of a transnational literary field and transnational literary canon. And today we would, of course, include literary festivals, book fairs, and other authorities such as this. Until recently confined to translation studies, studies on translation offer direction for the renewal of comparative literature, suggested by Emily Apter. The sociology of translation has also developed, and with my colleague Johan Heron at the Centre Européen de Sociologie et de Sciences Politiques, I have launched a program 15 years ago, which has since then produced a significant body of empirical studies. Relying on different sources, UNESCO's database, Index Translationum, national bibliographies, professional bookstores databases, publishers' catalogs, lists established by state representatives, the construction of databases of work in translation in various languages supply data for statistic flows, applying the word system frame of analysis to the flows of book translation across languages, countries, and cities, has revealed the asymmetries of exchanges between centers and peripheries. So I can give as an example the recent, you can see what is called globalization and the period when we thought there would be more exchange between countries. If you look at the exchange between languages, you can see a reduction of the, an intensification of translation, but a reduction of diversity, because English, who was already 45 of the translated books in the 80s, became accounted for close to 60% in the 1990s. And you can see that the language that fell, of course, is Russian, which happened after 1989. So then you can see it's not a simple reflection of the size of the different book markets. It's also political and cultural factors coming into account. And I have another, no, let's go back to this one. These databases are also a rich source for the study of what is translated from one language to another. We have the titles, the authors, the genre, the origin, publishers, and by whom, translators, publishers. So I just want to give some examples, because this quantitative data display patterns and regularity that help us understand the factors that may hinder or trigger the circulation of symbolic goods in a particular context, and raises the question also of the intermediary's motivation. So example of data, I've been working, for instance, on the history of translation into French for the whole 20th century, and I've been focusing also on Gallimard, because they gave me all the data in the archives for their centenary. So you can see Gallimard's list in 1936, the share of different languages. You can see English was first, because they started translating also American literature. You can see in the 1930s with Faulkner, Dos Passos. Russian was very important, and more than German, and this is the reverse figure compared to the national statistics. So you can know, because they had bought the Édition de la Pléiade, which was founded by André Schifrin, which was a Russian immigrant and who became the head of. So they developed a lot of the Russian translations. And you can see the diversity of languages, but you can see also that it's mostly European languages, apart from there is one Bengali, Tagore, of course, and of course the American literature. Another example, we won't get. It's a recent research on the translations of French literature in the US during globalization, and this is a network of publishers, French publishers with American publishers. And what you can see from this is the centrality of Gallimard. Gallimard represents 29% of the translated works. So you can see the symbolic capital of the publisher, which accumulated since the start of the century, and the fact that it is central in the network. It is translated by many publishers from different, so just examples of what we can do. And of course, this shows also elective affinities between publishers, because the circulation of works is not random. Publishers, Knopf will look at Gallimard more than a more commercial press, for instance. Okay, so yeah, and just because you're a literary scholar, I can show you the names of most translated French authors. I don't know if it's easy to, so you can see who are the most translated French authors in the US, You can see there is a mix of classics, Jules Verne, Victor Hugo, Zola, of modern authors, Proust, Camus, and of contemporary authors like Annie Ernaux or Marie Scondé. Okay, and so the focus is on the issues at stake in the reception field when we are interested in the importation patterns. The quantitative approach needs to be completed by qualitative data such as autobiographies and memoir archives, interviews, critical reception in the media, cultural events such as book fairs, festivals, literary prizes. So of course, this data, like we said yesterday, we can make sense of this quantitative data only if we know also the historical, the qualitative aspects. So the factors triggering or hindering the circulation of works can be separated for pure analytical sake in 4 categories: political, economic, cultural, social factors. Literary scholars and specialists of translation studies usually focus on the cultural factors and on texts. The historians working on cultural transfers have taken into account the political factors as well as the role of actors, but have neglected the economic aspects, while the historians of publishing have paid few attention to the issue of translation until recently. It changed 10 years ago, but until that moment it was really kind of blind spot of the history of publishing. The social factors were mainly identified by post-colonial theorists, gender studies, and sociologists of culture. In most cases, these 4 types of factors are embedded, but in some contexts, one type might prevail over and subordinate the others. So I will analyze them here separately. So first, political factors. Political and broader ideological factors may trigger or hinder the circulation of literary texts. Translation may serve political and ideological objectives. It can be a means to disseminate a doctrine or a vision of world. Parties and political organizations have contributed to the international circulation of works like that of Marx and Engels through more or less organized networks and to the building of a world canon of socialist realism. Lenin was the most translated author between 1955 and 1980, according to the Index Translationum database, as pointed out by Lawrence Venuti. However, this dissemination strategy can be countered by legal means. States have imposed legal frontiers through copyright, laws on the press, and political control on the circulation of print, which varies according to the degree of authoritarianism versus liberalism. Foreign publications often have a specific status and are submitted to more severe control. Whereas in 1956, the original publication of Nabucco's Lolita in English in Paris by Olympia Press was forbidden by the Ministry of the Interior, Gallimard had no trouble to release the French translation 3 years later. This example shows that translation may be a way to circumvent censorship. However, the very first attempt to publish the original book in France attests that the constraints the author had to face in his own country, the United States, which was less liberal than France, were very harsh. William Burroughs was confronted with similar constraints with Naked Lunch, first published in English in Paris by Olympia Press in 1959, translated into French by Gallimard, which had this time some difficulties with censorship. And it was republished in a different version by Grove Press in 1962 and was banned for obscenity in Boston and Los Angeles until the Massachusetts Supreme Court reversed the decision in 1966. Less risky than underground publication called Samizdat in Russian. While ensuring a broader audience, publishing abroad was a strategy adopted by many opponent writers in authoritarian countries, whether in the original language or in translation, like in the case of Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, first published in Italy in 1957 by Feltrinelli, and he was able to do it because he had the communist networks, or Milan Kundera's novels published in French translation before he immigrated to Paris, as shown by Ioana Popa. In countries where the economic field is subordinated to the political field and where the institutions governing cultural production as well as the organization of intellectual professions are state-run, like in fascist or communist countries, the production and circulation of symbolic goods are highly politicized. During the German occupation in France, the Third Reich forbade translations from French into German, except for a few writers who were active supporters of collaboration. At the same time, the German occupying forces imposed the translation of as much German authors as possible upon the French publishers as part of their policy to break France's cultural hegemony. Gallimard published, for instance, a couple of titles by Ernst Junger, which he had published before the war, but it was especially at that time. So, now the logic of the market, economic factors, the circulation of works in print depends on the book and press industries and on the distribution networks. The capitalist development of publishing gave a strong impulse to this circulation, which was fostered at the turn of the 19th century by the industrialization process, and later on by the development of means of transportation. Book production was concentrated in cities such as Leipzig, Paris, London, which therefore became cultural centers of linguistic areas. However, the circulation of books in the area depends not only on the production, but also on distribution networks. Despite a long publishing tradition concentrated in Beirut and Cairo, the lack of such networks prevents circulation of books across Arab-speaking countries till today. Competition between countries may also prevent it, as the Latin American case illustrates. The print market is thus structured around two types of frontiers: cultural, the linguistic frontiers, and political, the legal borders imposed by states through laws controlling the market and customs. Crossing legal borders within the same linguistic area depend on political, economic, and cultural power relations between countries. For instance, Hachette International, which is now a subsidiary of the conglomerate Lagardère, holds 85% of the shares in the educational book market in former French colonies in Africa, where the book industry is underdeveloped. The international book market is regulated since 1886 by the Berne Convention for Protection of Literary and Artistic Works, which makes it compulsory for publishers to buy exploitation or translation rights for books from their original publisher or literary agent during the period to which the copyright law applies. It's between 50 and 70 years. The law on copyright, which contributed to the professionalization of publishing and to the establishment of norms in the book market, all the while protecting the author and the translator from plagiarism, can also be regarded as a limitation to the circulation of books, which reinforces the power of the centers, since many publishers in poor countries do not have the means to buy the rights. I had an example, a Chinese example, that the law on copyright reduced the importation of books to translation in China. Economic considerations are thus involved in the production and circulation of books, and in many cases prevail over other ones. This is especially true in countries where the book market is liberalized. In the United States and in the United Kingdom, cultural goods appear primarily as commercial products that must obey the law of profitability. This is best illustrated by the process of manufacturing standardized worldwide bestsellers, such as 50 Shades of Grey. This is not a new phenomenon. Gone with the Wind has been such a bestseller in the 1930s, and for instance, Gallimard translated it into French in 1939, and it compensated because it sold 100,000 copies, and it was compensation because Faulkner did not sell, but Gallimard still continued to translate Faulkner. However, in the globalization era, the publishing industry has been more and more dominated by large conglomerates that impose fierce criteria of commercial profitability and operation to the detriment of literary and intellectual criteria. That was what Bourdieu was denouncing in the conservative revolution in publishing. And André Chiffrine and John Thompson in his book Merchants of Culture described this evolution. This concentration of the production is reinforced by the concentration of distribution around chains such as Barnes and Noble, which tend to focus on best-selling books. Consequently, many books are not even offered to sale by the retailers. This is especially the case for books in translation in the United States because of a collective belief in the weak commercial potential of translation. For instance, Barnes and Noble that didn't want the book by Bolaño, which became, which sold 400,000 copies, and FSG had to convince, and because it was FSG, it was a powerful publisher, he succeeded in convincing Barnes & Noble to take it, but otherwise it wouldn't have been distributed because it was a translation. Consequently, while the capitalist development of the book industry helped it to free itself from state control, the market can exert a commercial censorship that is only weakly counterbalanced by sales in independent bookstores and on internet in the United States and in the UK. To locate translations within the field of publishing, we need to understand its structure, which is polarized between large-scale and small-scale circulation, as Bourdieu developed. So the pole of large-scale circulation is ruled by the law of profitability on the short term, embodied by the bestsellers, whereas the pole of small-scale circulation, the specific logics and values of fields of cultural production, in our case the literary field, prevail over commercial consideration. So this opposition also structures the word market of translation that I've been able to show. Since the 1980s, translation from English, I showed, are dominant in the commercial genre, such as thrillers and romantic novels, destined to the mass market, in which linguistic diversity is very low. Moreover, English often compete in this sector with book production in the original language, which developed later. So I can give an example, comparison of the share of genre translation from English into French and from French into English only literature in the period in the 1990s. So you can see that the commercial genre, the science fiction and mysteries, their share is much more important in translation from English into French than from French into English. While from French into English you have a more important share of poetry and theater. So this is telling, though the numbers are so, there's such a gap in the numbers that it might be that the numbers are the same for poetry or even lower from French into English. But still the share, I think it's telling about what circulates from one place to another. It is also significant that series of commercial genres do not separate the production in the national language and translations, while in literary upmarket publishing, specific series of foreign literature were created, started in the 1920s, in the period we are studying here. There was a separation which favored the translation of foreign literature, which still exists. It does not exist in Anglo-American publishing anymore, but it does exist apart from a small publisher in Boston who has launched a series of foreign translated authors in 1997 to assert himself against the mainstream of publishing in the US. But in Europe, it's still a common separation. In France, it's very steady for upmarket literature. Now, if we observe this difference of the diversity of languages in commercial versus upmarket literature, we can explain why the share of translation is so weak in the US and the UK. There are very few translations at the pole of large-scale circulation of the publishing field, since they are considered as not profitable. By contrast, the pole of small-scale production is much more diversified with regards to the original languages from which books are translated, and this is all the more true in literature, which is the most diversified category of books. In France, for instance, since the 1990s, translations account for more than 1/3 of the new literary titles, as already said, and they originate for more than 36 languages and 40 countries. However, the commercial constraints also have more and more impact on the pole of small-scale production, especially in the US and the UK, despite the active implication of small independent publishers in the promotion of what they call in the US international literature. So there is a pole of small-scale production in the US, and I discovered that doing my research, and it's very active, though not very visible in bookstores, but they are very active on internet. So you can see that this frame, this opposition small-scale, large-scale, is allows to compare the structures of publishing fields in different countries. Now, cultural factors. Translation played a crucial role in the formation of literary and publishing fields by constituting a corpus of texts in national languages which helped to standardize, in some cases well before an indigenous production of texts in these languages developed. Translation also provided literary devices and models for writing modern fiction, as shown by Evan Zohar. Domestic literary production often appeared in a second phase after the translation phase. This process underlies what Franco-Moretti has called the Jameson law, after Frederick Jameson's analysis of the Japanese and Indian novels as hybrids of Western forms and local realities. I read the quote: "In cultures that belong to the periphery of the literary system, which means almost all cultures inside and outside Europe, the modern novel first arises not as an autonomous development, but as a compromise between a Western formal influence, usually French or English, and local materials." The most translated works form the new canon of world literatures, as already said, and shown by Pascal Casanova. This canon of modern literature in vernacular languages progressively replaced the classical Greco-Latin canon, which continued to be dominant on the world market of translation until World War II. There is a study by Daniel Milot in Annal in 1993 that shows this using index translationum. Authors like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Horace, Plutarch, Seneca, Plautus, and Tacitus, who were among the 60 most translated authors at the beginning of the 1930s, according to the Index Translationum, disappeared from this list after the Second World War. Plato was the only one who survived. They were evinced by Tolstoy, Dickens, Dostoevsky, and Balzac, to quote only the steadiest on the list of the 30 most translated writers. The new canon was limited to European literature, apart from a few exceptions, such as the Indian Nobel Prize winner Rabindranath Tagore, who won it in 1913. In the 1950s, the UNESCO launched a program supporting translations from non-Western cultures in order to favor what they called literary interpenetration. This program encouraged editors and publishers to start translating classical and modern works from Asia and Latin America, enlarging the borders of the international market of translation from Europe to the world, although whole areas like sub-Saharan Africa were and are still excluded from this market. For instance, in France, the sinologue René Entangled created in 1953 a series titled Connaissance de l'Orient, as he explained to Roger Caillois, who was in charge with this program at UNESCO, in a letter dated 5th July 1953, Etienne's purpose was to render, I quote, accessible to French educated public works of high literary quality that were never published in our language or so badly translated that it is better not to talk about them, and chosen in order to illustrate the mores and cultural values in all the countries in question, India, China, and Japan to begin with, but I would like to include Persia and the Arab world. Neither the publisher nor myself are looking for immediate commercial success. We want to educate the public, to enlighten the Orient for them. But it goes without saying that we will have to, at the beginning especially, offer them titles that encourage them to educate themselves. Novels that, while possibly entertaining them, inform them on people that they are not familiar with. Most of the great novels from Asia are unknown in France. This letter emphasizes the pedagogic function ascribed to translations of upmarket foreign literature, especially those issued from peripheral regions. The idea that literatures can inform us about the culture and mores of country, which also underlies the teaching of foreign languages and civilization in France, for instance, as in other places, contributes to explain the rise of translations from certain peripheral languages. Despite the length and scope of the endeavor, the great Chinese novel Hong Liu Meong was 2,500 pages. 10 titles had been published in this series by 1960. If, as expected, the sales were modest, and I calculate an average of 1,189 copies, so this is not bestsellers. The series still filled the gap in French culture and publishing and was highly praised by the critics for that. This series illustrates the specific logics of cultural fields, which gained autonomy from political and economic constraints. This logic is irreducible to ideological or financial motivation. Many authors, translators, editors, and even publishers undertake projects which they know will not bring them any commercial benefit, as Etienne's quote exemplifies. Instead, they can expect symbolic profits such as recognition in the field. This was the case in the 1930s when Gallimard decided to continue to translate Faulkner despite the fact he was not selling, and he was sad that he could not find the public, but he did, and he developed strategies also. So this is also an interesting aspect of circulation, to study the strategies for importing and installing and also appropriating foreign authors. So in the case, it was very common at the time, it's not anymore, now it has been replaced by the blurbs, but it was very common at the time to have a preface by a famous author. So if, for instance, Malraux was asked to preface Faulkner's Sanctuary. They also decided to publish Sanctuary before As I Like Dying because they thought it would sell better or make him more visible. So this is also interesting, the strategy of the order of publication. And of course, we have all this issue about labeling prefaces, critics who appropriate the work and can use them in their own the literary field of reception. So, for instance, Sartre wrote on Faulkner and used the Faulkner and Dos Passes to subvert the norms in the literary field at the time. He was criticizing Mauriac and the omnipotent narrator from the standpoint of these novels. So this is also the more interesting literary aspect of reception, is the appropriation of models for developing new narrative techniques and subverting the dominant literary norms. Pascal Casanova gives a lot of examples of that. And I mentioned earlier Flaubert with the device of the impersonal narrator and free indirect speech. He borrowed these two techniques from Goethe, as suggested by Norbert Wolf, and they were new in the French literary field at the time. So, social factors. The cultural factors at play in the circulation of literary works are not devoid of social dimensions. The selection process is embedded in power relations between social groups. For a long time, the canon of world literature was mainly composed of white, male, Western authors. As we saw above, it started to extend to non-Western cultures in the 1950s thanks to a voluntary policy set up by the UNESCO. Asian and Latin American authors achieved international recognition in the 1960s and 1970s. The literary prizes are a good indicator of this recognition. So if you take, for instance, the Nobel Prize, Miguel Angel Asturias won it in 67, Kawabata 68, Neruda 71, Marquez 82. The only Arab writer who won it to date was Naguib Mahfouz, 88. The recognition process took even more time for the post-colonial authors who had to develop specific strategies for drawing attention, as argued by Graham Hagel. It was not before the 1980s that African authors became visible on the international literary scene, and Wole Soyinka won the Nobel Prize in 1986. 3 years before, the Académie Française, the oldest French literary institution, co-opted the Senegalese poet Senghor. In 1987, a Francophone Arab author, Tahar Benjeloun, won for the first time the French Goncourt Prize and became one of the most translated writers from the French in the US between 1990 and 2003. He had 6 titles translated. The access of post-colonial writers to consecration contributed to relativize national categories in the perception of literary works, whereas national and consequently international literary authorities tended to promote national authors rooted for more than 2 generations in the country, residing in the cultural centers, and coming from middle and upper classes. A growing interest in writers who were formerly relegated to the margins because of their geographic or ethnic origins came to the fore around 1992. That year, the St. Lucian poet Derek Walcott was awarded the Nobel Prize, the Sri Lankan-born Canadian novelist Michael Ondat the Booker Prize, the French Patrick Chamoiseau from Martinique, the Goncourt Prize. So it was a moment, and it was the moment when world literature was designating these kind of authors. Women were also marginalized by the literary authorities, although many of them had been active in the literary field and market since the 19th century. In France, the Goncourt Literary Prize, founded in 1902, was not awarded to a woman before 1945. Elsa Triolet won it for the first time. To protest against the Goncourt's misogyny, a group of 22 female writers launched in 1904 for the Femina Prize awarded to either female or male authors, because if they awarded only to female, they would be totally marginalized in the field. Marguerite Yourcenar was the first woman to join the Académie Française in 1982, 1 year before Senghor. And there was a whole debate because you know, you have an épée, how do you say that in English? Comment?
Spade.
Spade?
Yeah.
So they are really dressed in, and they have spade, and so you could not give a spade to a woman. So it was a whole debate how she will. Okay, so in the world market of translations, women or female authors are still underrepresented. Only 1/4 of the literary works translated from French to the US between 1990 and 2003 were authored by a woman. And if you look only at contemporary titles, it raises to 1/3. And I must say that the Anglo-American market is the most open to women, most interested in women. So I think the share in other languages would be much lower. Not to speak of the consecration by the Nobel Prize. The first woman who won it in 1909 was Selma Lagerlof, an author of youth literature, followed by Grazia Deledda in 1926, Sigrid Undset in 1928, Gabriela Mistral in 1948, Nelly Sachs in 1966, she shared it with Agnon, Nadine Gordimer in 1991, Toni Morris in 1993, Elfriede Jelinek in 2004, Doris Lessing in 2007, Herta Müller in 2009, Alice Munro in 2013. The female authors account for 11 out of 113 Nobel Prize winners, less than 10%. The rhythm accelerated in the 1990s, so you have 6 female authors who won it since then, contra 5 during the first 90 years of the 20th century. After its globalization since the 1960s, we thus observe a feminization of the world literary canon parallel to the inclusion of post-colonial authors. Nevertheless, all these authors are published in the centers of the global literary market, and those writing in central languages are more likely to get international recognition than those writing in peripheral languages. The study of cultural transfers and literary exchanges thus help us to denationalize literary history. Nevertheless, studying these transfers requires that we scrupulously reconstitute the relevant spaces. Indeed, without such an operation, we risk missing that which is essential, that is to say the forms of reappropriation and reinterpretation of circulating works and models according to the specific issues at stake within the reception space in a given social historical configuration. However, it also requires a structural analysis of the unequal system of relation within which these transfers take place. So now, conclusion. Franco Moretti distinguishes 2 evolutionary models, the waves and the trees. These 2 models apply to the history of literature, and they can be explained by two opposite processes, isomorphism and differentiation. Isomorphism, as analyzed by neo-institutional sociology theory, results from 3 types of mechanism. This is a paper by Dimaggio and Powell: constraint, imitation, and professional norms. Constraint is the main homogenizing instrument in authoritarian regimes. The canon of socialist realism was in large part imposed by the USSR to the other communist regimes. Imitation is typical of competitive free markets. Publishers will give preference to works already selected by their peers in other countries in order to reduce uncertainty. By the same token, the very model of national identities was imitated from country to country, entailing a process of nationalization of literature. This is an argument by Anne-Marie Thiès. It was a kind of a wave spreading, building national identities on the same model. You have to have a music, a literature, a painting, and so on. Professional norms spread around the world through professional organization, as in our case the Publishers International Union, taken over by the national unions, or the Pen Club, which has local sections in each country, and through also literary agents. These norms may vary within the field of publishing, between the pole of large-scale and small-scale production. For instance, if we speak about norms of translation, faithfulness to the original work and direct translation, two norms that have become widespread in upmarket publishing, do not apply in more commercial realm. And in children's literature, it's very frequent to change the names, the color of the eyes, the color of the hair to make it domestic, you know. So the norms of upmarket publishing clearly stem from the literary and academic fields, where originality is a central value since Romanticism. Originality is a principle of differentiation that counterbalances the tendency to isomorphism in creative industries. So I want to oppose this principle to isomorphism. We have the two tendencies. There is a tension between the two. The principles of originality applies not only to the work or to the cultural producer recognized as a creator, but also to publishing. A literary publisher has an identity. It is a brand name which labels a certain kind of products. Being published by Gallimard, it identifies you for the reader, for the foreign publishers who will be more interested in this product than others. So it's a label that refers to a selection process. Publishers play a role in gathering literary groups, such as the Nouveau Roman around Édition de Minuit, so there was also a label here. The signification of brand names on the world market of symbolic goods is related to their symbolic capital, of course. Their list, their renowned authors, the number of Nobel Prize winners they have, and so on. For instance, the Seuil accumulated cultural capital. They were devoid of literary capital at the start, and they accumulated symbolic capital through translation. They translated all the groups 47, Günter Grass and Riedel in the 1950s, at a period when German literature was not very attractive because of the war, and they accumulated through the translation, and all these authors won the Nobel Prize later. The signification, sorry, I said that already. Publishers tend to, imitation does not occur mechanically nor randomly. Publishers tend to follow the choices of some of their foreign peers rather than others, so then you can speak of elective affinities. So you do not imitate for imitating, it is chosen. The principle of distinction also applies to nation states, which all claim to have a national literature. The long-lasting prominence of the national as a category of literary classification, despite the globalization process, the emergence of multinational corporations and the growing isomorphism at the pole of large-scale production of the transnational field of publishing, is revelatory of this differentiation logics. Differentiation also applies to the post-colonial exotic, as defined by Graham Hugan. He defined it as the global spectacularization of cultural differences. Finally, appropriation, which is never mechanical and therefore cannot be reduced to mimicry, also introduces differentiation through hybridization of genre and cultural tradition. So we mentioned already Padura, and there are examples in Venuti, where the mechanism favoring isomorphism translates into homogenizing waves. The differentiation process induces ramification that shape trees. Swamped by the mass market, the pole of small-scale production constantly resurfaces and extends its ramification. But waves and trees are descriptive models and do not provide explanatory factors. From a methodological standpoint, a comparative structural history of literature requires to combine three temporalities, as I said: the longue durée temporality of institutions, for instance, the Berne Convention on Protection of Literary Works, or the Nobel Prize, or some publishing houses. Categories, for instance, national framing of literary products and the genre classification, and structural phenomena such as the centralization of the book market around certain cities, which are still there. I mean, Paris is still the center of the Francophone area. It has been longing for centuries, and there have been attempts to oppose from Belgium and now from Quebec. Longue durée also, the United States succeeded to reverse the domination of London, which is still there, but now shared. Longue durée also refers to processes such as liberalization or democratization of education, which did not occur in every place at the same time. The midterm temporality of configuration of a field in a specific social context, which defines a space of possibilities, is the second temporality we have to look at. For instance, I mentioned the political constraints that were imposed upon the French literary field during the German occupation, and which had a direct impact on the publishers' lists, explaining the rising number of translations from German. Same for the Eastern European countries under the communist regime. The rationalization and globalization of the publishing industry since the 1970s is another example of configuration. But the configuration concerns also the structure of the field and the space of literary possibilities. The symbolic revolution in poetry, with the legitimization of free verse against the classical norms, or that of internal monologue in the novel, or these are examples of configuration. This symbolic revolution spread around the world following the imitation wave, but were not synchronic. And the short term of agent strategies and interactions, for instance, Gallimard asking Malraux to preface Faulkner, or the launching of Entangled series Connaissance de l'Orient, these short-term strategies can also be determined by field effect as by extra-literary events, such as the change of political regime, though these extra-literary events are retranslated into the specific logics of the field. So these three temporalities underscore both comparativism and the study of literary transfer. Transnational literary history thus has to combine them to make sense of literary evolution. So if I think of, oh sorry, I skipped, so never mind. So if I think of to conclude last observation on the period under study in this conference, we can see that there was a differentiation through the nationalization of culture, which is more a political factor, isomorphism, modern world canon of literature, circulation of literary models, but also hybridization of models which created difference, and also temporal gaps, which also creates difference. Internationalization of the book market in Europe, which is configuration with the Berne Convention and the role of countries, and I differentiate the internationalization process from the globalization process, which is more based on the market. In this period, we have more the role of states, which organize the market. And so the political and economic factors and also cultural are very much embedded. So if we compare to the globalization period, I won't develop, but you can see that here the market becomes much more important. At the same time, we have the opening of the canon to, because the canon, as we said, was very European, male, in the white in the former period, and it has opened in the since 1950s to non-Western countries and also to women, and we have the development of the international, the global book market with the book fairs and festivals, and the challenging of the national framing of literature through émigrés, minorities. And I will stop here.